phase and polarity in audio often get confused. So in this video, I'm going to explain the differences between the two and why understanding them is so fundamentally important for every mix you do. Learning how to mix is more than learning how to use EQ, compressors and effects. At some point, you've got to take a step back and make sure you can trust what you're hearing. To turn out better and consistently good mixes, you need to ask better questions of yourself and of what you're hearing to make more informed decisions. And you can't do that if what you're hearing is flawed and it's not providing you with a true representation of the instrument recorded. Whilst polarity and phase aren't as sexy as reviewing the latest fancy EQ plugin, it is vitally important to understand what each one is and how they have the potential to ruin a mix if ignored, and especially the ramifications on the low end of your mixes. Polarity and phase are two different audio and electrical concepts that are often confused and misunderstood. So today, I want to explain both, because getting them working for you instead of against you is the first step in getting any EQ and compression processing to work to your advantage. Musical instruments create sound by modulating the air, producing sound waves. And sound waves are the pulling and pushing of the air molecules. And these changes in pressure vibrate our eardrums in the same way and are interpreted by our brain into the sounds we hear. A microphone capsule senses these same pressure changes, converting them into positive and negative electrical impulses, which are fed into our recording equipment. The pushing of the air molecules is called compression, and that produces a positive voltage. And the pulling is called rarefaction and produces a negative voltage in a circuit. Unfortunately for us, there are a myriad of places that this simple concept can get screwed up. A cross-wired cable on one speaker, for example, means that the speaker cone is pulling when it should be pushing air. And if only one out of your stereo speakers is doing this, then your speakers are said to be out of polarity, and the sound is impaired in some way, typically like narrowing the soundstage or reducing the bass. This isn't just reserved for speaker connections. It can be any connection between any piece of equipment can cause this switch in polarity. So polarity is the positive and negative aspects of an audio signal. And we see this as the plus and minus across a median line here, shown using a simple sine wave, just to simply illustrate the point. So polarity has nothing to do with time or frequency. Just think of the positive and negative terminals of a speaker or an amplifier, and the forwards and backwards motion of a speaker cone, that push and pull of air. Positive values push the speaker cone out and the air towards you, and negative values pull the speaker cone back and the air pressure away from you. And conversely, the capsule of a microphone works in exactly the same way, reacting to the changes in air pressure that a sound source will produce. And when a piece of equipment is out of polarity, it's cross-wired. So positive is attached to negative and negative is attached to positive. And this means that the speaker cone is pulling when it should be pushing. And this can happen anywhere. Cables, inside equipment even. Microphone cables can be wired incorrectly, and sometimes they can be a real struggle to try and find. Fixing this switch in polarity is relatively straightforward. The button with the diagram of a circle with a line through it on a channel strip or a mixing console switches the polarity of a signal 180 degrees, flipping it to the mirror image of itself. So if the red line on this diagram was the original signal, the polarity button will flip this, inverting it so that the red line then becomes the blue line. If you get two identical signals being played back at the same time, and one has the polarity flipped in this way, They will cancel each other out. Remember, these are positive and negative values we're seeing here, voltages that sum together to get you right back to zero again. And zero is silence. One area typical of needing this polarity flip is on a snare top and a snare bottom microphone. They are more often than not out of polarity with each other. One is pushing the bottom, whilst the other is pulling the top. Think of the stick hitting the top skin of a snare. The skin itself depresses away from the top microphone and is therefore pulling. And at the same time, pretty much, the bottom skin is pushing. It's bowing out with that shift in air pressure inside the body of the snare. And therefore, the bottom microphone is picking up that pushing movement. And this results in that thin or hollow sound as frequencies are being cancelled out between the two microphones. And if the top snare mic is in phase with the overheads, then hitting the polarity button on the channel strip or an EQ plugin, for example, inverts the bottom snare track and it will magically bring back that lost body, fullness of the snare. So how do you identify if something has been recorded with the polarity inverted? And how do you identify if it really matters? When you look at the waveform, you start to see the similarity between that sine wave diagram that I showed you earlier, where you can see that the median line runs through the middle of our waveform and everything above it is the positive voltage or signal and everything below it is the negative. And when you look at the leading edge of the signal, you can see that the polarity of this signal is heading down in the downwards direction. Therefore, the leading edge is of a negative value. Now, when you see this on a snare drum, your instinct may be just to decide that this is out of phase or out of polarity, whichever phrase you happen to have habituated into your head. And this is the main clue that should trigger some sort of thought process where you might need to check if this is actually causing you a problem with the sound source in question. So when it's a signal on its own, it's not a problem. But when it's a signal that's being picked up by multiple mics, it can be a problem. Here we've got a snare top and we've got a snare bottom. And if I open up the snare bottom, you can see that the waveform here is starting in the positive. So it's opposite to the top mic here. And this is potentially going to give us some problems. So what do these actually sound like? Well, you may not even realise that you do have a problem until you start to fade something up. So what I've got here on this snare recording is I've got the snare bottom faded down. So I'll just play this through and see if you can hear what happens to the sound of the snare. So it gets thinner. The snare loses its body. So take a listen again. I'll mute it for speed. So here's just the snare top on its own. Okay, naturally going to bring in more high frequencies because it's the bottom mic and it's just captured the snare wire sound. And that's the whole purpose of a snare bottom, is to bring back some of that raspiness that we love about snare drums in rock mixers. But we don't want that at the expense of the body of the drum. So you've taken a look at the waveform. Oh yes, you can see that there is a mismatch here with the leading edge of the signal where the polarity is wrong. How do you decide which one needs to be flipped? Well, when it comes to mixing drums, the overheads are usually, not always, but usually chosen as a common reference for the rest of the kit when it comes to making sure your phase and polarity are where they should be. So in this case, after opening up the overhead track, you can see on this snare hit in the overheads, here look, that the leading edge is negative. So therefore, the signal you want to flip the polarity on is the snare bottom. As a general rule, using the overheads like this as your reference point with phase helps stop you getting confused with which phase button or polarity button to use on what track. So what does that sound like in our example? Well, let me play this section again, and I'll start with the snare top, then I'll unmute the snare bottom, and then we'll look at the famously confusing phase button. So you can hear that it's changing the tone of the instrument. It's bringing back some of that body that has been cancelled out when we introduced the snare bottom mic into the mix. There are other places to find a phase button like this, and that would be on an EQ plugin. And your DAW may offer you a quick way to actually invert the whole audio track by 180 degrees. In Pro Tools, it's done in Audio Suite, and under Other, and you find Invert. And what that does is, we open up, zoom in here on our snare bottom, and we were to select the track, Audio Suite, Other, Invert. And when I click Render, just look what happens to the waveform. There. And it's just flipped it 180 degrees, and that is inverting polarity. Let's look at phase now. What is phase? Phase is the position of a sound wave in time, and it has nothing to do with polarity, and it's measured using the degrees of a circle. And a waveform is 0 until you move it forward or backwards in time. And these forward or backward changes at the starting point of a signal are what are called phase shifts. So a phase shift is the term used to describe the extent to which one signal is shifted to the left or right horizontally relative to another signal. And this happens when you've got two microphones recording the same source and they're at different distances away from the source, even just slightly, and they can cause some frequency cancellations and unnatural sound. You might not notice the effect of small phase differences between two microphones, but the more out of phase the two are, the more tonal changes take place and the more obvious it sounds. And this is something that you come to recognise. So remember, phase is all about the position of a sound wave in time. So it's when an identical signal is arriving at the recording medium at a slightly different point in time than the first. And this can affect the tone of a sound in so many different ways, depending on how early or late this signal happens to be. It can sound like the low end has disappeared. It can sound strangely hollow or nasal sounding. It really depends on the signals involved as to how it sounds. And you might describe as sounding phasey. And this phasiness is that unnatural quality to the sound. It just doesn't sound quite right. And a typical place this happens is when you've recorded a bass DI and a bass amp at the same time. The sound coming out of the speaker cone on the bass amp and the distance between the speaker cone and the microphone picking it up contributes to a slight difference in time of the DI, which has taken the signal straight at the source. And that mismatch between the two, that latency, can give you audible phase issues. Now, this confusingly can be fixed by popping the polarity button in and out, or you can actually physically move the waveform in time so that it better lines up. There are also plugins on the market that can do it for you and work it out for you and do it automatically. But always, in my experience of recording instruments and mixing through an actual physical console, when you heard these anomalies, the first thing to do would be to try and flip the polarity button. And on a bass guitar, the telltale sign of this anomaly would be a lack of low end, or the low end disappearing when you introduce the second signal. So let's listen to this bass guitar that we've got here. First thing I'll do is I'll just play the DI and listen to what happens to the low end when I start to fade up the bass amp track. And you can hear the bass actually did lose a little bit of low end. And also at this staccato point here, you could hear that sort of phasiness, that honkiness, nasalness. And when you hear that, you instantly recognize it. The first thing you do to try and fix it would be to use our polarity button. So this is the channel strip on the amp. So let's play that track again and see if it helps us get the low end back to our bass guitar. Yeah, I think that's hopefully very noticeable to you. The thing with phase is you can keep nudging the signal to really fine-tune the effect by manipulating the phase relationship between two signals. Now that is probably the subject for another video, but as a quick fix, going to the polarity button is going to fix the problem. When taking a close look at the signal, you can see that the bass amp is ever so slightly later in time than the bass DI, and that's what's causing the issue. There's nothing to stop you physically moving that back if you wanted to get the tonal quality that you wanted. It really comes down to personal preference. Some people don't like to move tracks once they've been recorded. That's down to you and your personal preference and how you like to work. That is phase. Phase is the moving in time of an audio signal when compared to a reference, which occurs physically because of the distance of the multiple microphones on one source being different to each other, or like in this case, a DI'd signal versus a mic'd signal of the same part. And it's causing a time delay and creating these tonal shifts. So when somebody describes something as being out of phase in this way, in this example, what they really mean is that they're out of alignment. They don't line up with each other. And this misalignment is quite different to a flip in polarity, which is actually reversing the signal. I accept that this is a really oversimplified explanation of phase and polarity. But once you've kind of got this basic concept, then you can explore it further, because the two topics, particularly phase and how audio signals interact and then change, particularly using EQ, you can get really, really in-depth and nerdy about it. Here, I just wanted to give you a simple overview on the difference between the two. Now, the most common place in a mix where this is going to cause you the biggest problem is going to be on a drum kit. Multiple mics picking up multiple drums, all at various different times. And so checking the phase on drums is something you have to do on every mix. As a matter of course, don't ignore it, because it massively affects the sound and tone of your drums. Forget getting a deep, heavy kick or a fat sounding snare if the recordings are either out of polarity or out of time, misaligned. One last word then on this bass example. It may be that using the button as we have here to get some bass frequency back into our combined DI and amp tracks may not work for you. And this can happen often, because flipping the polarity like this by 180 degrees might not necessarily correlate with the time difference between the two signals. And so it may not work. And if that's the case, the quick fix isn't a quick fix anymore. And what you can do is you can either physically, as I said, move the waveform in time. As I said, some people don't like to do that. They like to keep the tracks where they are and just manipulate them at the plugin level. And there are a few plugins that you can use to do that, various alignment plugins. If you don't have Pro Tools, must have some sort of time adjustment plugin that comes bundled with it. These allow you to really fine-tune the phase relationship between two signals, rather than being stuck with that flip, 180 degrees flip of the polarity invert. Using a high-pass filter is another way to control any phase issues in the low end on signals by getting rid of any frequencies that aren't necessary, that you don't need in the very low end of signals. Then you're going to eliminate the problem altogether. It's no surprise that there's a general feeling of confusion around phase and polarity in the audio world, as the terms are often used interchangeably, and I'm guilty of that as much as the next person. Phase shift implies a shift in time relative to some sort of reference, while polarity is a reversal of the positive and negative terminals of an audio connection. The phase switch on your channel strip plugin or console channel does not shift the phase by 180 degrees because that would involve a shift in time. It's simply a polarity reversal switch, and this is where the confusion originates, because when a signal has a phase shift of 180 degrees, it looks identical to a simple polarity inverted signal. But the two, technically, are very different things. Two identical waveforms of opposite polarity will cancel each other out, as will two identical waveforms where one has been shifted in time by 180 degrees. Same result, but different circumstances. Hence the confusion. Once you know how phase and polarity impacts on the tone of an audio signal, you can start to use them to your benefit or to fix problems baked into a recording. In the real world, musical instruments produce many layered and complex sound waves, not a simple sine wave. And this results in tonal changes when they interact with other frequencies, where some frequencies will be reinforced and therefore boosted in level, and others may be cancelled out slightly or significantly in extreme cases. Sometimes, if a sound is out of phase, it isn't necessarily bad or wrong, it's just different. You can think of it as a tone control. And this can happen with parallel compression or parallel distortion, where more of the parallel signal you add to the dry signal, the more the tone changes. And it can actually help the low end by tightening it up, whilst adding the reinforcement you needed in the mid-range. If you don't like the way the tone changes, then flip the polarity switch and see if that helps. Or you can use a low-cut filter to fine-tune the effect and steer it more to your liking. You can use the polarity inversion trick to set up a de-esser or a vocal ducker using a gate on a duplicated track, or even to quiet down an obnoxiously loud snare in drum overheads. But I think I'll leave that for another video. Phase is also used to enhance stereo imaging and width, but you must check your mix in mono and make sure the signal is still audible for your mum when she's listening to your music on the kitchen radio. Getting the low end right in a mix is a challenge, so on screen now are a couple of videos that will help you once you've got any phase or polarity issues fixed. One will help you compress bass guitar, and the other is all about that kick and bass. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.